Okay, and what I'll do too, because I didn't want to play it on our part of the recorded video, I wasn't sure about the copyright, but what I will do is I'll include the link for the people who were listening by audio who would not have just heard the song. You will be able to hear the next one because it's just a short clip. But we're talking about the Passover. And at some point, I don't know if we'll need it tonight or if it'll be tomorrow, if you have an Orthodox Jewish Haggadah, we're going to be referencing some things in there that a lot of people, if they do use an Orthodox Haggadah, they skip over it because they believe it's irrelevant. They say, well, that's not in the Torah, and that's boring. But sometimes things are boring because we don't know what their context is. And the context of some of this information that is in the Haggadah is directly related to that song, believe it or not. Because we're talking about a people who have been enslaved. The problem now is if we are not enslaved, then it's going to be really hard to identify with what we're commanded to do. Because what we are commanded to do is in the retelling of the Exodus to the next generation and to the next and to the next, depending on the number of years we have to experience exactly what the Hebrew slaves experienced in Egypt. We have to convey exactly what a Hebrew slave would have felt to our children and our children's children. The difficulty with that is most of us have never been slaves. And it's hard to teach from an experience you've never had, although we do it all the time. But in terms of conveying, for instance, you could read, 10 books on the Holocaust. But if one little old lady next to you in the grocery line hands the cashier some money and you see the tattoo on her arm, do 10 books equal the experience you just had in the checkout line? Because now you have stood next to someone who was in a death camp. You were standing next to someone who likely lost most of her family. You were standing next to someone who had to rebuild a life. I mean, you talk about PTSD. Okay, she probably had to deal with some, because now all the book learning in the world isn't a thimbleful of what this old lady can tell you, even without saying a word. And so that's our challenge at Pesach, as we're going through these plagues, and we're just basically going to cover 3 of them in this lesson. But in conveying this to our children, yes, we do want to make it fun at Pesach because we want them to look forward to Pesach. We have to teach, and you can't teach children when you have them terrified, although I have done that before. I'll have to take responsibility for that. I did dress up like the plague lady one year, and I did terrify children. Just note to self, if there's no exterior windows, don't ever cut all the lights in a room, okay? and especially when you don't have adults screaming on cue. That's not helpful. If they don't know it's coming. Now, if they know it's coming, then it's fun. But at the very same time that we want them to have fun, we also want them to engage the seriousness of slavery and what it would have felt like to be a slave. And to have that hope, like we talked about last week, with Moses comes along and says, there's hope for you. And they say, great, there's hope. And then the work gets harder and Moses disappears. Oh, wow. Okay. So that hopelessness, we want them to engage that as well. But before we can teach it to our children, we are the ones who have to do exactly what the song said. We have to put ourselves in those shoes. We have to try to put ourselves in that position. And when we actually put ourselves in that position, the only logical response we can have is to tremble. It's not a laugh. It's a trembling. It's an absolute trembling. In the midst of the fun, we need to have some trembling moments when we think about the Passover, because we know there's a greater exodus coming. And if it's on such a bigger worldwide scale than it was in Egypt, then I can guarantee you that the trembling will also be on a much bigger worldwide scale. And the Hebrews had to endure the first 3 plagues. And then there was a distinction made between them and the Egyptians. But you can imagine after plague number 3, the Hebrews don't know that they will be excluded from the rest of the plagues. They don't know that. For all they know, it's not going to stop until Egypt's destroyed. And so you have the added uncertainty. It's open-ended. What's going to happen at the end of this? Where is Moses going with these plagues? Is he just ticking off Pharaoh so Pharaoh will kill us faster? That's trembling. When you truly put yourself in their places, you should tremble at the power of Adonai. And how he literally dismantled a nation so that his people could walk out. So let me pull up the PowerPoint here. And we're going to look at a textual anomaly. And it's the anomaly is the number of frogs. The text seems to disagree with itself, because in some places it'll say frogs, and then in others it'll say the frog. And so anytime that happens, we know Rashi's going to be looking at that, trying to figure out, well, why does it say frog here and frogs there? But at any rate, the Torah portion is Vaera, and appeared. And I would encourage you, because we don't always have time to go fully through like the Brit Chadashah reading. I'm going to use a text out of Revelation 16 so that you can see some parallels here. But Matthew 10, 22 through 33. I'm hoping we have time to get to it at least by tomorrow. But it's an important text because it's very much pertaining to this Torah portion and the things that we're going to have to endure before the redemption comes, the final redemption comes. So we're going to look at the frogs in the oven. Of all the places the frogs could have gone, the oven seems to be, now bedroom, that would be gross. True, you don't want frogs in your bed, but you can see how a frog would hop in a bed. Our question is going to be why would a frog hop in an oven? You know, we're all familiar with the frog in the boiling water analogy, but in that one, you know, the frog goes into the cool water and then it gradually heats up so he doesn't know he's boiling. And I'm not suggesting that, by the way, just to see if it works. But in this case, we have frogs who voluntarily hop into ovens. That's odd. Not just the fact that we don't know whether it was a frog or frogs, but the fact that the frogs would actually go into the ovens. Okay, so here's picture the sheet music from Were You There? And here's the background, because this is one thing I wanted you to think about before I started the song. Who would have written it? Why they would have written it? Who would have sung the song? We don't know exactly when it was written, but it was first printed in 1899. And it says it was likely composed by enslaved African Americans in the 19th century. And it first appeared in print in an Episcopal church hymnal in 1940, which made it the very first spiritual to be included in an American hymnal. So it's a historic song. And I believe the reason that it's a historic song is because of the content of the song. It's a very simple song. It's only introducing one new line. in each stanza. I don't know if you noticed that, but in the brevity of the words, it's screaming the things that we need to think about. And if you notice the singer, and this is typical with this song, it's not a fast song. Nobody's supposed to sing this song fast. It's supposed to be sung slow so that the listener can contemplate, so that the listener will actually be transported back to the crucifixion. In our case, be transported back to the Passover. So basically the answer is yes. So if you didn't know the words, I'm throwing these up here on the screen, but look how many times the reaction of trembling, it's repetitious, trembling, tremble, 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 tremble. In each stanza, it's not only asking you to put yourself in that place at that time, in that experience, because of the brevity of the words, you can actually feel it. You begin to feel the emotion. You begin to feel the sorrow. You can almost begin, or maybe you can, you get this visceral reaction where you can actually feel the pain of the nails, of the piercing. And then the last stanza too, this is important, because again, as we're looking at our plagues, there is going to be a plague where there's 3 days of tangible darkness. And that's the question. Were you there when the sun refused to shine? Were you there? And the question has to be yes. If we're going to observe a Passover Seder, we have to be there when the sun refused to shine. We have to be there when the lamb was slain. So let's go to Psalm 46, and we're going to circle back to some of that concept, but we're going to pick it up with a different situation of subjugation, right? Because there's 2 types of slavery, and the Israelites, again, are going to demonstrate this. At the Passover Seder, you remember a slavery when they were outside of their own land, when they were in exile. But there were also occasions when they were in slavery and exile within their own land, when the Greeks and the Romans ruled, and they prohibited them from studying the Torah. When they stopped the temple services and so forth, they were actually experiencing the same thing, but it was their own land. And we're going to contrast these 2 different types of exile and slavery. But here's the psalm for the Torah portion. And I want to read this because there's a phrase in here that's going to be important as we're looking at the Nile. It says, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. And that's appropriate for the portion. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth should change, and though the mountains slip into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains quake at its swelling pride. Selah. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy dwelling places of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She will not be moved. Okay, we've studied enough together that you know where that river is. That's the river that ran out of the upper Eden, and it watered the whole Garden of Eden. Yeshua is identified with that river of Eden. And what does that river do? It makes glad the city of God. It becomes a dwelling place, not just of the human beings who were there, but it becomes the dwelling place of the Most High, which is that promise of the ultimate Yom Teruah, when Yeshua returns in the cloud and he gathers his people in there. And that's what he says. God is in the midst of her. She will not be moved. God will help her when the morning dawns. Okay, keep that in the back of your mind too. When does help come? It comes when the morning dawns. There's going to be 2 specific times of day that you want to say the Shema. And that's going to be the evening and in the morning. The nations made an uproar, the kingdoms tottered. He raised his voice, the earth melted. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold, Selah. Come, behold the works of the Lord, who has wrought desolations in the earth. He makes wars to cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and cuts the spear in two. He burns the chariots with fire. Cease striving and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold, Selah. So we've got a few different things here that I think the theme will stay consistent through the Torah portion. Number one, there is a river that makes glad the city of God. There's a contrast here with the Nile and the river that ran out of Eden. And see, just as the Nile was Pharaoh's dwelling place, he was called like the great crocodile of the Nile, and the people believed that he created the Nile. It was his dwelling place. He would go out there every morning, which is how Moses could find him. What he was actually doing, the rabbis say, is he would do his business out in the river so the people would not know that he wasn't a god and he was just like them and he did every normal thing that they did. So we've got a contrast here with two types of river. When the morning dawns, help is coming at the morning Shema. And then ultimately he says, what will happen? I will be exalted among the nations. Not one of the 2,000 gods of the Egyptians, not Pharaoh who thinks he's a god, but the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Israel. He is the one who will be exalted among the nations. So a group of rabbis were sitting around debating, which they like to do, and they asked the question, which is better, Torah study or actions? And of course they had their debate, but the conclusion was that study was better because it led to action. In other words, it's going to be difficult to do the action if you don't study what you're supposed to do, because if you do go off half-cocked, number one, you probably will not be doing the commandment. Or number two, you will not be doing it properly. You might misunderstand what it's asking you to do. And we can see that just in our week-to-week Torah study, because you can think the text says one thing, but when you really analyze the Hebrew, it might be saying something a little bit different. So you study so that it will lead you to better actions. And what's important to know about this debate? Is it just another rabbit trail? The context of this debate is going to tell us a lot, because in the first century, it was kind of a repetition. Remember, we said there was two types of exile, the exile and the slavery you have outside the land, and then the exile and slavery you can have inside your own land. So in the first century, the Romans had just repeated what the Egyptians and the Greeks did before them. Pharaoh tried to cut off their worship in Egypt, but the Greeks basically exiled them in their own country. They wouldn't allow them to study Torah. They wouldn't permit circumcision. There were all sorts of ways that they tried to prevent the Jews from observing the Torah in their own land. And so the Romans come along, and it's just a repetition. There came a point that kind of reached its apex after the death of Yeshua until the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, but they had virtually cut off all Torah study, especially in public. You couldn't gather together and study Torah. In fact, if you were caught in a public display of your faith, studying Torah and so forth, there were all sorts of bad things that could happen. You could get crucified, scourged with whip. You could, in the case of Rabbi Akiva, while he was still alive, they took iron combs and they removed his skin from his body until he died. So the context of this debate is that particular time period where public displays of Jewish faith could get you not just killed, but tortured and killed. The context of this question, which is better, Torah study or actions, is related to one of the mitzvot of Pesach. And it's the one that we started with when we listened to the song, where it says each generation is to engage the telling of the Exodus as if he or she personally experienced it. So when you do this, it's not just a story. It's not just a debate over whether you should have an egg on the Seder plate. It's not just a matter of selecting the right Haggadah or writing your own Haggadah. The point of it, of talking about it and telling about it and asking questions about it, is to make you feel as though you were there. The point of it is to make you feel that pressure. And the more you sit around and talk about it, the more you will begin to feel that pressure. If it's just a matter of getting through the Seder so you can eat and go back home and have the next day off, we're kind of missing the point here. You need to feel the pressure of the government's desire to kill you just because you believe Moses. And so in answer to the question, were you there? The answer is yes, you were. You were there. Just like you were at Sinai. You were part of that body of Messiah, even though you hadn't been born that yet. You were there. And when you keep the Passover, when you keep Shavuot, it is so that you will remember something that you say, well, I haven't really experienced it. Yes, you have. And it's your job to discuss those things, to study those things, and to act upon those things until you feel as though you were standing there, until you feel the pressure. Just like these rabbis asking this question, which is better, Torah study or actions, knowing that the next knock on the door could be for you to come kill you for sitting around asking questions about which is better, Torah study or actions. So that's the context. They're talking about, okay, how do you explain to the next generation as though you were there? You have to feel the pressure. And so that begged another question. Because he's given Moses his name, I am that I am who I am. All sorts of different interpretations of what he actually says. I will be whatever you need. I will fill in the blank. But the question was, okay, if Adonai wanted to, he could just remove Israel from Egypt, no sweat. I mean, it wouldn't have been difficult because he's the master of the universe. And if he just wanted Israel to walk out of there, all he had to do was really, I mean, just like with Sodom and Gomorrah, blind the Egyptians and the Israelites can walk out. That's it. They can just walk out effortlessly. So if it could have been done effortlessly, then why do they have to go through all these plagues first? I mean, it's like Alan's dad used to say at Thanksgiving when his mother would want to go around the table and everybody say what they were giving thanks for. His dad would say, isn't there an abbreviated version of this? Could we just eat? Which I hear that didn't go over well. But at any rate, why did they have to go through the plagues first? Why do we have to go through the things we go through before the final redemption comes? Last week, I got 4 different death notices. I don't remember there being that many deaths, you know, with people that I know in some way or have some relationship to. Most of you have heard about Joe Good's daughter who passed away. May her memory be for blessing. And so we ask ourselves at times like that, if he is the healer, if he is the creator, and if he is the master of the universe, why do we have to go through all this? He can just heal us. It's that easy. And I don't know that there's a real answer to that on this side of the river. But the rabbis agree that there is a theological purpose to the plagues, that we can look back and we can see that it was a vital part of a process. The people had to form both a collective as a nation and a personal concept of salvation. I mean, we say salvation today, we assume people know what that means. They don't always, because it can be very nonspecific. It can be applied to other things. We can use the term loosely where it just kind of loses its meaning. But without these plagues, they say our understanding of Adonai would be insufficient. We wouldn't know all the things we need to know about him, because it's actually the knowing that emerges in times of trial and tribulation. There is an intimacy. And those of you who have done Workbook 1, you're familiar with Ruach Da'at, which is the 6th spirit of Adonai in Isaiah. It's the spirit of knowledge. And it doesn't mean what you know in your head. It means what you have experienced. Yes, you have the head knowledge, but if it were only that, we could say it's understanding, wisdom and understanding. But because it's something experiential to you, you have been intimate with that situation. Now we can say that you are functioning in knowledge. And without the tribulations, then our intimacy with Adonai, our understanding of who he is, would be insufficient. And they say one of the purposes of the plagues was to establish the truth of God's existence. And I think we have to agree at this point. We have a lot of religious people in Christian denominations who aren't sure if God is real. I don't know how it happened. I don't know when it happened. I don't know why it happened. But you can read the statistics, you can read the research, and you realize we've got a lot of agnostics teaching in seminaries. And we wonder why the church is in such bad shape. It's because the people who were supposed to be the leaders are not establishing the truth of Adonai's existence in their students. They're not planting that in their students because they don't know him. He is not something that has been experiential for them. They don't know for sure. But see, once they had gone through those plagues, once they had gone through this process of release through tribulation, everybody knew for sure that Israel had a God and that he was supreme. And he was separate from any other entity that might claim to be God. Even though they had over 2,000 gods, even though Pharaoh proclaimed that he was a demigod, what they knew for sure when everything was said and done is they knew he existed. Whether they wanted to serve him or not, they knew. And they say this was the purpose of the plagues. If the Israelites didn't know him, then through this pressure of slavery, they would. If Pharaoh didn't know him, as he claimed not to know him, through pressure, he would. If the Egyptians and the mixed multitude didn't know him, through the pressure, through the tribulation, that's what tribulation is in Hebrew. It means like being constricted into a tight place where there's nowhere else to go. They're going to know it. whether they desire him, whether they love him, irrelevant. They will know that he exists. So last week, and this is just funny, guys. I mean, I've never seen this before this week when I was studying, and it dawned on me how crazy these first 3 plagues are. But remember, last week we focused on the Chag. Remember, Moses marches in and says, you have to let Israel go 3 days' journey into the wilderness to observe a Chag, an appointed time, a feast day, an act of worship. And once these plagues start, he's going to issue a clarification that is consistent with what we said right back here. No matter where you fell in Egypt, whether you were the slave, whether you were Pharaoh, or something in between, when the 10 plagues were complete, you would know that he existed. And so Moses adds this information in Exodus 8:10, and this was incidentally in the frog plague. Busy, stop it. And so he asked Pharaoh, he says, when do you want the frogs to go away? And Pharaoh's crazy. Pharaoh says tomorrow. And so Moses said, may it be according to your word, that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. So see, that's the point. When all this is over, you're going to know. There'll be no doubt in your mind. You may not choose to serve the King of the universe, but you will know that there is a king higher than you. So, and the issue of the frogs, we have 2 types of frogs. Exodus 8:8-14. It says, Pharaoh called for Moses and Aharon and said, entreat the Lord that he remove the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go, that they may sacrifice to the Lord. Moses said to Pharaoh, the honor is yours to tell me. When shall I entreat for you and your servants and your people that the frogs be destroyed from you and your houses, that they may be left only in the Nile? And he said, tomorrow. So he said, may it be according to your word, that you may know. You notice the word know keeps popping up. That's on purpose. Remember, knowing is experiential. That you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. The frogs will depart from you and your houses and your servants and your people, and they will be left only in the Nile. Then Moses and Aharon went out from Paro, and Moses cried to the Lord concerning the frogs which he had inflicted upon Paro. The Lord did according to the word of Moses. Well, imagine that. And the frogs died out of the houses, the courts, and the fields. So they piled them in heaps, and the land became foul. So, in the text, we know that you can divide the frogs into one of 2 categories. There were dead frogs, and twice it describes frogs that are going to be left only in the Nile, which is their habitat. That's where they belonged. They belonged in the rivers. They didn't belong in bedrooms and kneading bowls, and they really didn't belong in ovens. So dead ones, and then the living ones in the Nile. And so what Moses is going to do is he's going to prove that his word, and remember, his word is God's word, right? He says, I'm going to make you like God to Pharaoh. Why? You're going to be an extension of me. You're going to proclaim my word. And so that word is going to control the blood and the frogs in the Nile. The problem is, remember, Pharaoh thought he invented the Nile River. He thought he created it, that he was a demigod. And so a lot of the people actually believed it. Remember, all these building projects they're always doing, it's to convince people of the lie that they actually are gods. But here's the question I ask myself. If Pharaoh actually did create the Nile, I'm trying to think like Pharaoh. Remember, you got to put yourself in those shoes so you can feel those same pressures. then why could Moses turn the Nile into blood and death? But if Paro created it, why couldn't he return it to life? See, if he created it, he would want it in its life-giving state so that it could flood when it was supposed to flood, so that they could grow the crops and so forth, so that there would be plenty to eat. And strangely, what Pharaoh asks for, he doesn't say, hey, magicians, look, Moses has turned the Nile into blood. What I want you to do is, I want you to get rid of the blood. Pharaoh's crazy. He has to make more blood. That's, you don't, If you created that, you want it in its best condition. You don't produce more death. But see, sin makes you stupid. You don't think through things. If he was wanting to do a proper sign or a proper miracle, then the proper one, if he cared anything about his people and his animals, he would have said, transform the blood in the river back to life. Take it from a state of death to life. Clear it up. So instead of looking for ways to restore life, Pharaoh gets into a magic competition with Moses. And so what's going to happen is it's bad enough, like, okay, Moses is bringing death into Egypt by turning the river into blood, and then Pharaoh brings more death into Egypt. But he needs to know what the frogs knew. And whatever you think about the frogs, one thing the frogs did is they obeyed. Pharaoh didn't obey. The frogs obeyed. So Pharaoh didn't even know what the frogs knew. But before that, if you'll remember, Moses and Aaron, remember they throw the staff down and it turns into a serpent? And Pharaoh's already done this once when he tries to get into the blood competition into the Nile. Back with the serpent, Moses makes a serpent out of the staff, and Pharaoh tells his magicians, well, I want you to make a snake too. Why would you have your magicians make more snakes? Snakes represent original sin. Snakes bite people. Snakes kill people. If he wanted to do a real miracle, then Pharaoh should have told his magicians to make the snake that would swallow the first snake. In other words, swallow up death. Instead, Moses' snake has to show Pharaoh what the proper miracle would have been, and he swallows the magician's snakes. And which goes back to our premise, sin does make you stupid. You miss the obvious. And you see this so often nowadays. It's like people miss the obvious, most simple answers because they think it's a competition. And they think it's a competition because they have not acknowledged that there is a master of the universe. They still want to be master of their own lives. And the longer you run with that determination that you alone are the king of your life, then the stupider, I'm not sure what stupidest, the dumber you get. And then we get the blood river. Pharaoh's false prophets, they make more blood. After blood comes frogs. And the frogs go all through Egypt. They go everywhere. There's millions of these stinking frogs. And Pharaoh, when he gets a choice, okay, magicians, I want you to do a miracle too. Just show Moses and Aaron, they can make frogs. Well, guess what? We'll make more. We'll make more frogs than they do. And that's another head smacker. If the frogs are getting into everything, even into your ovens, if they're in your bedroom, if they're in your bed, if they're everywhere you're trying to walk, then the solution to that is not to make more frogs. The solution to that would have been, if you're a magician, then tell them to get back into the Nile where they belong. So again, it was another head smacker. They say the Egyptians, there was another plague not mentioned, and that had to have been all the headaches from the Egyptians smacking their heads when Pharaoh would pick the wrong miracle or magic. It wasn't a miracle, it was magic. It was demonic. And it's, my analogy is it's a lot like watching politics today. The longer you watch, the more you say, if these are the people running the country, then things can only get worse, and they do. So we got to figure out a way to quit making more frogs. We got to figure out a way to quit making more blood. We got to figure out a way to eat up the snakes. Those frogs serve a function. And the only way they can serve that function is to get back in the river and start singing. Because if you take a frog out of water, it's just a matter of time until it dies. We're not talking about toads. We're talking about frogs. Frogs are amphibians. They need water, but they can also live on land for a limited amount of time. But they need the water in order to do their special job. And a frog's job in general is done at a specific time. Although bullfrogs can be much more random, especially in mating season. We've got ponds in the back and ponds in the front. And on a summer night, you can hear those bullfrogs. They are loud. But the singing frogs, and if you're not sure what a singing frog is, I'm going to play you the clip for you so you can hear it. But here in Kentucky, sometime usually mid to late March, when we start having some warm days and some longer days, all of a sudden you'll hear something like a cheep, almost like a bird, one evening. And it may just be that one for an evening or two. But by the time it warms up, it's a whole chorus because all the frogs are singing. And that's how you know spring is coming. You're still going to have some cold days, but when you hear the frogs singing at night, you know Passover's coming. And in fact, usually around Passover time, we get invaded by these little tree frogs that come up on our front windows and just stick up on the front windows. I'm not sure what the point of that is, but it's pretty funny, you know, when you pull the curtain back and there's frogs plastered all over your front window. Frogs are funny. But they have an assigned job and they have an appointed time to do that job. So if you've never heard frogs singing, okay, so you heard the frogs singing, but you also heard a familiar tune. You heard Amazing Grace. And this song was actually sung on the Trail of Tears, believe it or not. On the Trail of Tears, you know that the Native Americans were displaced from their native lands in the south, southeast, and they were moved on the Trail of Tears up into Oklahoma Territory. And one of the most amazing things, even though so many died on that journey, one song that they sang over and over was Amazing Grace. And that's meaningful, or it's going to be meaningful when we learn a little bit more about the bird of knowledge. But it's ironic. We've got the African American slaves who are writing in this expression of "Were you there?" capturing the whole essence, basically, of our Torah portion and the commandment to experience in the telling of the story the literal feeling of being there, of being pierced, of being there when the sun refused to shine. But with the Native Americans, you have another people who have been subjugated in their own land. Like the Israelites with the Greeks and with the Romans. They're in their own land, but they're in no way in charge of what they're doing. And so the singing frogs, or the singing frog, you can break down the word for frog, Vaera, into two words. And I broke it down for you there. Tzipur, which is bird. Remember, Moses had a wife named Tzipporah, bird. And the other word in there is dea, dea. And you know that two letters because they're part of something we've been talking about, knowledge. Da'at, which is another noun construct. So it's the same root. It's experiential. So what is a frog? Why does it sound like a bird at night? Well, its essence is it's a bird of knowledge. It can't fly, but it is a bird of knowledge. So let's go back again to some first mentions. In Genesis 3:20, it says, the man called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all the living. The Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. Then the Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing, yada, good and evil. And now he might stretch out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore, the Lord God sent him out from the Garden of Eden to cultivate the ground from which he was taken, which kind of reminds you of the language of Pharaoh's daughter when she stretched out her hand and took Moses out of the river. But he's saying, I don't want this man to stretch out his hand and take from the tree of life and then exist forever in a state of intimacy with good and evil. What happened there? Well, Adam and Eve didn't keep their garments. They mixed the dea of good and evil. So they were unprepared for Elohim to visit them in the garden. Remember, they hear him walking in the garden, they're trying to hide because now they know they're naked. They're naked because they did not keep their garments. And until that time, until they fell in sin, their souls could fly like a bird in the garden. They could be elevated. They could be in that, they could function both in a spiritual and a natural realm equally well. But see, when they believed the lie, and then they acted upon the lie, then they fell. Then they descended because they didn't keep their garments, because they experienced both good and evil. Isaiah 68 speaks of a return. Remember, we fell out of the garden, but the point of Yeshua is to help us over those rivers to go back into the garden. In Isaiah 68, it's kind of a repetition. Remember when Yaakov is blessing Ephraim and Manasseh, and at first he pretends like he doesn't recognize them, and he says, who are these? And that's a question that's consistent. But he says, who are these who fly like a cloud and like the doves to their lattices? So this idea of flying like a bird, remember in the rabbinic tradition, the lower Garden of Eden is no higher, it's the third heaven, it's no higher than the height a dove would fly. So this passage in Isaiah is kind of hinting to a time when there would be people like Ephraim and Manasseh, who are these, who fly like a cloud. Again, that would place us at Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, at a gathering at the resurrection. And then he compares them to birds. Why? Because the dove is representative of that being to fly back into the garden. back to that elevated spiritual position. And remember, the palace of Messiah in the garden is called the bird's nest, Kansipur. You hear Sipur again, because it means bird. That's what Yeshua came to do, restore our power to fly back into the garden through an altar sacrifice of his resurrection. But while we wait for him, the apostles are telling us, keep your garments, keep your garments. That was John's message, keep your garments. In other words, as we're sitting here waiting, we still have to do the same thing that Adam and Eve were commanded to do. We still have to guard our garden. And that takes a continuous evaluation process. Why? Because the evil is mixed in. We have to exercise the knowledge of good. How do we exercise the knowledge of good? We study good. We don't study evil unless we spend a lot of time watching movies and listening to certain types of music and sitting in front of certain television programs. Then you're studying evil in order to do it. So I'm just watching it. I'll never do it. Well, okay. Keep studying and we'll see what you end up doing. That's why we study Torah. So that you're embedding the daya of good, the knowledge of good, to help you guard the Torah in your life so that you can keep your garments. So that when he comes and walks in the garden, you won't be ashamed and feel like you need to hide because you did not keep your garments. You just kept experiencing evil because you enjoyed it. But the feast, the appointed times, the Sabbaths, they're there to help us with this process. Because remember, in that menorah that we've looked at in the graphic, you can see how that river of life, it flowed from beneath the heavenly throne in that upper garden, but then it came down and it watered the whole Garden of Eden. So they were one way, representative of the Holy Spirit, representative of Yeshua. That was one way they guarded the garden. But there's a secret here. And the frog knows it. And the frog sings that secret. If you were listening to those frogs sing in the clip, those frogs were telling you something in frog language. So if you don't know frog language, you don't know what they said. But you don't have to know frog language to know what they said. We're going to find out what they said. Because when Israel hears a frog, when they hear that water song, it reminds them of the river, but not the river of the Nile below. It's going to remind them of the Nile above, which was the Pishon River. It was the outer river, the outer boundary of the Garden of Eden. And so when a frog sits in the river and sings, it reminds you, even though that frog can't fly, its name means a bird of knowledge, a knowledgeable bird. We can't fly. Although I think we debated it one time as we stood on a roof. Fortunately, we didn't. I think I was like 8, but as it turns out, people can't fly either. But someday we will fly. We're going to fly on the 5th day, the 5th feast, Yom Teruah. Like knowledgeable birds, going back like doves to their lattices. Why does a dove fly back to their lattice? Because it's home. They know how to get home. They're like homing pigeons. They know their way back, no matter how far away you take that dove from its lattice. When it's time to go home, that dove will return. And the frog knows this, and it reminds us of this. And so here's the conflict in the text. And I wanted to show it to you in Hebrew for those of you who can read it and compare. Now, our problem here, we went over this last year. The numbering is off between the English and the Hebrew versions. So I put the English on there for you, which is going to be Exodus 8, 5, and 6. But if you're reading, say, in a Tanakh, then it's going to be chapter 8, verses 1 and 2, where you have the conflict between whether it's frogs or frog. And so in the first example, you can see in bold, I put the word for frogs. I didn't put it, I just copied and pasted it in there from the scripture. And you can see it's hatzfardim. Hatzfardim, it's plural. But in the very next verse, it's singular. Hatzfardea. Why is it two different things? Why is it plural then? Why is it singular? That's the question. Well, this anomaly shows up in a different plague. So I wanted to remind you of this. We went over this last year, and it's in the revised workbook too. If you remember in Revelation 16, 1 through 7, you've got some matching texts to the Exodus. One of them is talking about the angel with the bowls. It says the first angel went and poured out his bowl on the earth, and it says it became a loathsome and malignant sore on the people who had the mark of the beast and who worshiped his image. Now, if you don't remember from last year, go back and review, if you still have your recording, and review the fact that they said there was actually 2 hidden plagues. There was actually 12 plagues. The first plague had already begun before Moses got there, because marks of leprosy had already started to break out on Pharaoh's household beforehand. And so it says it became a loathsome and malignant sore, singular, on the people who had the mark of the beast. So is it one sore, or a sore on each person, or lots of sores on each person? It's like there's an intentional message within the text. Because the plague of boils was believed to have started as one boil in the Jewish tradition. And it says, and then that one boil then multiplied into many boils or cysts, however you would translate it. The precise meaning of a boil is heat. So we have a context here where we can see that, okay, it says it was one sore, but we know it had to have been many. So the plague of boils is one example that helps us understand the frog. Why they would say one frog after they'd already said more than one frog, lots of frogs, piles and piles and piles of stinking frogs. So this led to a lot of theories about what happened. One theory was that it was one enormous frog that covered all of Egypt, and they hit the frog repeatedly to kill it, but it started spawning. And Rashi said it was streaming forth swarms and swarms of frogs. Rashi also said it was a swarm of frogs, but it's just referring to it as one entity. Like we say sheep, which is plural, but we can say sheep for one sheep. But then he goes back and says, but that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because if you were going to do that, then why wouldn't you be consistent? Rabbi Akiva said, the one frog bred so rapidly that it filled Egypt. And then Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says at first there was only one frog, but it croaked, it whistled to the others, and they all came. And so the Passover Haggadah gives us a setting for this discussion. When did this, which obviously Rashi wouldn't have been there, he lived in a different time, but the conversation between Rabbis Akiva and Elazar ben Azariah, just to refresh your memory on who Rabbi Akiva was, he was the one who thought that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. He made a big mistake, and a lot of people followed after Bar Kokhba, and they got killed because he was a false Messiah. He was not the Messiah. The Messiah had already come. And so Rabbi Akiva made this mistake, but it gives you the time setting. And so this would have been the setting for the discussion. Why are they sitting around talking about the one frog, many frogs? Why does the text say this? That kind of seems like what we want to avoid. Because we say we want to avoid debating insignificant details to the exclusion of the spiritual meaning of a Torah study. In other words, just sitting around in a yeshiva all day, sipping bourbon and smoking cigarettes, that's not really the spiritual intent of Torah study. Not that that's ever happened. But instead we study, remember, in order to enable us to do. So we read things like this and we think, well, isn't that exactly what they're doing? They're sweating the details to the point, like, who really cares whether it was one frog or many frogs? And then you have to say, well, we do. We want to know why one verse says this and the other verse says that. But here's what they said. And if you have, let me stop sharing for just a sec so I can show you this. I like to use this because it has big letters. You can get it from Art Scroll. It's cheap. I think they were, what, $5? But if you've ever done an Orthodox Haggadah, this may have driven you crazy the first 5 years. Because the first 5 years, you're just going through here and you're like, okay, where's Jesus? Show me where Jesus is in here, right? And then you start reading about rabbis and you say, I don't understand. Why are they putting all this stuff in here about rabbis? I'm trying to find Jesus, right? and that's a stage. That's an age and a stage, right? But when they put things like this in there, sometimes it's a hidden message. Remember a few years back, I told you there's the one section in here where the rabbis are going through and they're making up impossible numbers for the numbers of miracles at the sea. And the number gets bigger and bigger and you're like, that's insane. And then I said, because it's a joke. They're telling jokes. They're trying to keep kids awake. It's a joke. Don't take it so seriously. Laugh. But see, we're just, where's Jesus? Where's Jesus? And he's in there. But at some point, you have to kind of like step back and say there's other things in here that might be meaningful. Once I've found Jesus in the Passover, and I'm good with that, and I'm secure, and I know it's a picture of Messiah, but there might be some things to learn in here. And remember the questions. The 4 questions were, why is this night different from all other nights? So if you've got a Haggadah, right after that section, they go into a paragraph that says, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, but Hashem our God took us out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And it has like a paragraph. Then there's another paragraph, and here's what it says. And it was on the PowerPoint. It says, it happened that Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yehoshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon were gathered at the Seder in Bnei Brak. And you're like, okay, now we're getting a history lesson? But hang on. They discussed the Exodus from Egypt all that night until their students came and said to them, our teachers, the time has come for the reading of the morning Shema. So now you know the time history, all right, just prior to the destruction of the temple. You know that they would sit around and they would talk about Torah all night, discussing the Passover, the Exodus from Egypt. And in fact, they discussed it so long, their students came in and said, hey, it's time for the morning Shema, the sun's up. So basically from evening until morning, they were sitting around talking about the Passover. And this is exactly what we need to do. Now, I don't know if we can hang out that long, but to have a sense of reverence and awe, like the song was saying, tremble when you think about that experience of the Passover lamb on the cross and him being pierced. And when the son refused, that should make part of us tremble. We are glad, but we should also tremble. And so they become so engrossed in this study that they talk about it until it's time for the morning Shema. Now, let me ask you this. When does the frog start singing in the river? When do they generally stop singing in the river?
Down to sunrise.
That's it. When you start hearing the frogs in the evening, it's time for the evening Shema. About the time the frogs give up in the morning, it's time for the morning Shema. So a frog song, among some other things, is telling you something. It's time to say the Shema. So then, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, I am like a 70-year-old man, but I could not succeed in having the Exodus from Egypt mentioned every night until Ben Zoma expounded it, in order that you may remember the day you left Egypt, all the days of your life. The phrase, the days of your life, would have indicated only the days. The addition of the word all includes the nights as well. But the sages declare that the days of your life would mean only this present world. The addition of all includes the era of Messiah. So when you think about the Passover, let me pull the slide back up and then we'll try to find a stopping place. Okay, so here's what they're saying. And they're talking until the time of the morning Shema. But the part of the story that's not in your Haggadah is that Rabbi Azariah actually rebuked Rabbi Akiva for his attempt at understanding the lesson of the Exodus frogs. And so after he rebukes Rabbi Akiva, who said, well, it's one frog that just bred so rapidly it filled all of Egypt. He says, no, who are you to make up these things? And so he follows with his own explanation. He says, at first there was only one frog, but it croaked, it whistled to the others, and they came. Now, the second one, I don't think is any less fantastical as the first one. What's going on here? And that's why I say there's messages embedded in here if you know what's happening. We know from history that what was going on in that dialogue was prophetic. Even though Rabbi Akiva was a great sage of his generation, he made a huge mistake. He thought Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. And that mistake on his part led to a huge slaughter of the Jewish people. And then after that, exile, being sold back into slavery. But even before that, they were enduring great suffering under the Romans in their own country. But for teaching Torah, eventually they caught Rabbi Akiva teaching, gathering students to teach them Torah. And so the Romans took him, and in a public place, you can go to the exact spot today. They took iron combs and they basically cut his skin off of him while he was still alive. And his students reported that he died while he was reciting the Shema. And they're asking him, even now, teacher, you're still going to proclaim your faith? I mean, you could have stopped teaching, or you could have hidden your teaching better so they wouldn't catch you. And now, they're literally taking the skin off of your body. Even now, you want to say the Shema? But see, it was a two-pronged prophecy. When Rabbi Akiva whistled, a lot of Jews flocked to Bar Kokhba, false Messiah, and they were killed. On the other hand, his martyrdom, his death at the hands of the Romans sparked a huge movement toward Torah study. And the students who witnessed his death said that he drew out the word echad. And today, if you'll look in your Siddur, and a lot of them, when it has little instructions on how you're supposed to say the Shema, they will tell you to draw out the word echad a little bit. And that's actually taken from the final word of Rabbi Akiva, because he wanted to die with the Shema on his lips. And so he drew it out just a little bit longer so that when he did die, the Shema would be in his mouth, proclaiming the unity of Adonai, proclaiming the power in the kingdom of Adonai. And remember, Rabbi Akiva was the one who said study has to come before action. And one of their debates that they were having as they're going over some of these other topics we're talking about, what constitutes martyrdom? When are we as people of faith, when is an Israelite called to be a martyr for his faith? And they said basically three things. You can mess up on a lot of commandments, and you shouldn't have to die for them, because we were told, that you may live by them, not die by them. But they said if somebody is asking you to murder, it's better to give up your own life than to murder another human being. Sexual licentiousness, it's better to give up your life than to commit a sexual immorality. And the biggie was idolatry. It's better to give up your own life than to worship an idol. And they said that was Rabbi Akiva's rationale as they were talking to him as he's dying. He said, I have studied and studied and studied my whole life. And we've debated this question of when are we called to die for our faith? And he says, I can say the Shema as I'm dying. And this will be an opportunity to actually do what I have studied all my life, to avoid idolatry. And so that is the context. When we're in the Passover, okay, I'm going to stop the share there because we've running over on time pretty good. But that's the idea. When you're sitting at the Passover Seder, you need to feel the pressure. And this is what Rabbi Akiva was saying. I have sat and debated Torah all my life. I have studied the details of Torah all my life. And now I've got the opportunity to actually do what I have been preparing for all my life. Now, I'm not recommending that you run out and become a martyr if you don't have to be, but it's in the context. They're studying the Passover as some of these conversations occur. That's why you're seeing it in the Haggadah. That's the context, talking about the Exodus all night long. And so we have basically this prophecy that takes place about Rabbi Akiva's huge mistake and his death. And so maybe he didn't understand who the Messiah was, but he knew who the Master of the universe was. And he died with that on his lips. He died with the Shema on his lips. And that's the thing with the Pesach. We can study a Torah portion. We can have a Seder, and have a great time. But how are we going to feel the pressure? That's only probably going to come through doing. To really feel the pressure of the Exodus, to really feel the pressure of tribulation, to the point that I will now say, I have experienced the Father in my life. You experience the Father in your worst times. That's when you truly get to know him. And that is truly when Rabbi Akiva learned about idolatry and what the cost of avoiding idolatry could be, and what the cost of Torah study could be. What if right now they weren't trying to enact laws to keep you from buying a gun? What if they were enacting laws to keep you from having a Passover Haggadah, or for having a Bible, from having a group that would sit down and study the Bible in order to do the things in the Bible? What if people were out actively looking for you, for daring to study, for daring to study in order to do? That's a completely different kind of pressure than any we've ever experienced. But see, we are called every Passover to try to the best of our ability to feel what they would have felt in Egypt, to feel what they would have felt when the Greeks occupied the land, to feel what they would have felt when the Romans occupied the land. And where they were meeting when they had these conversations was up in an attic. So nobody would know. But Akiva came out of the attic. So we don't know how that judgment's going to roll out. It's not our job to figure out. That's a conversation he and the Father are going to have about the Messiah. But in terms of that example, having made a huge blunder, a huge mistake that led many to their deaths for accepting a false Messiah. But then his dying words were the Shema. And so no matter what blunders we've made, and I've made some big ones, and that's why James tells us not many should become teachers, knowing that you shall receive the greater condemnation. We're all going to look back at the things we taught to our children and, people in our sphere of influence. We'll have to give an account for that. But at the end of the day, let's just die with the Shema on our lips and acknowledge he is the master of the universe. There is none other. There is no other God. He's the one. He's the one. And then I think we can trust in his judgment after that, in spite of all the blunders. And I think this is where Yeshua rushes in. And where he says, nobody can snatch you out of my hand. Bar Kokhba. Don't follow Bar Kokhba. But Yeshua is your advocate with the Father. And he can take you by the hand and he can get you across that river. So I hate to stop there because it's just now starting to get good, I think. But anyway, we'll save a little bit for tomorrow's class. But I'm trying to bring all this back so it makes sense. In terms of the only way we're going to know him is through pressure. That's it. And it's not the answer, but it's the only answer we have, really. There's more to it, but we just don't understand it yet. But we will understand it. That's where faith comes in. And it's almost like James says, well, James writes in his letter, he's really hard on rich people. Yeshua's hard on rich people because he knows how hard it is for them if they've not experienced trouble in this world to know the Father. Not that they can't, they can. But the more pressure you endure in this life, the more sorrow, the more grief, the more piercing, the more betrayals by your friends and family, the more of that, as long as you don't just become an offense, as long as the bitterness doesn't set in, then it's just pulling you closer and closer and closer to the great shepherd of the sheep. And you can say, yes, I was there. I was there, and I tremble. I tremble in a holy reverence for what he's doing in me through this pressure, and I embrace it. And I have to be cautious because when you say something, something happens, right? But that's the end of that road. That's where it leads. Is that pressure is just building your faith. And eventually it's going to make a distinction